Yes.
Hello. Are you in Kosovo?
Yes, I landed a little while ago. I'm in Pristina. You're in Gelato, yeah?
Yes, I'm in Milan. I did as you asked me. I set the appointment for cutting your hair, and I didn't use your name. I said Miguel Sanchez, as you told me to.
Sanchez, perfect. Yes.
But it's at 3 a.m. Can you make it?
3. The problem with 3 is that it is opposite the monologue. So can we try to move that?
He said we can't, but why not do both?
We'll do both. Let's do both.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Live from the wonderful town of Pristina in Kosovo, it's the Committee Program, the chronicle of the world's most mysterious global political strategic entity. On today's show, Monday, May the 31st, Ellie Mae O'Hagan, Jamaä Bickley-King, Paolo Gerbaudo, Dr. Cristina Fominaya, Jorge Rosina, Michael Walker, critic of the show Roberto Capocelli, and featuring committee's deputy director, our own Julia Doubleday, and the rest of the committee gang. And now, a human being so vain he writes these little bits about himself, by himself, while forcing you to watch him get his haircut, the director of committee and our host, Arun Chaudhary.
Having German moments, like something will happen that's very German and I'll be surprised. I'll be like, whoa, that was really German. I'm crossing the street doing a red light and someone stops and still the
Buddy, I lived there for so many years. I've been to...
I lived in Texas right before I moved, so that's why no one talks about it. And it wasn't even their fault. It was the other team that dumped all their vaccine in the jump rope. And so now I'm using all these extra moisture, this, that. It's kind of insane, I
sense some... See what I mean by valid?
Oh yeah.
Otherwise, I see cuts it up if you want. I don't mind, I'll have fun. You want a bit shorter here?
Only if you think it's okay, though.
Hi, welcome to this edition of Cross Atlantic Crosstalk. We are so glad you could join us today because we have an extra special panel. I say that every time because it's true. But with us is the usual gang, Julia Doubleday and Ellie Mae O'Hagan. But joining us from the great state of Virginia is Jamaä Bickley-King, who is actually not only a longtime friend, but back when I was at Revolution Messaging, we almost made a podcast starring you. Actually, it was going to be our own branded thing that I don't remember why we didn't do because we like to come up with plans and then not do them. And this sounds maybe like a project on the progressive left. Who knows? But listen, before we get into what was crazy in the UK, which was a deposition of Dominic Cummings that was as long as Castro's eulogy of Che in 1968. And before we hear from Jamaä about the election coming up in Virginia, that is very traditionally the kind of biggest post-presidential election to kind of see where the tea leaves are falling. I almost said tea leaves are blowing. That was not going to make any sense. But first, Julia, the state of American progressives, exciting news. Maybe you can tell us what happened with Katie Porter and an endorsement in a special race.
Yes. So Katie Porter endorsed Nina Turner in the Ohio special election for Congress for the 11th district. So
which is Cleveland-ish.
Cleveland-ish. So obviously it's very exciting. I think Nina Turner is just this very needed voice in Congress. I don't think people were necessarily planning on her actually being in Congress at any point when they were really deriding her a lot throughout Bernie's last run for president. I'm really looking forward to her being able to, push back on the center because she's very, very vocal and very committed to her values. And this decision of Representative Katie Porter's to endorse her, I think really speaks to, one, the sort of burgeoning alliance between more of the center left and the further left, and two, just the fact that she's likely going to win. I don't think that she would have endorsed if it wasn't quite likely at this point that she's going to win that seat.
Especially for our international audience, like, would you describe this as one of the first kind of Warren supporters and Bernie supporters co-project?
I guess you could look at it that way. Yeah, I mean, Katie Porter, like you said, she was a Warren endorser, and I know there was some bad blood over Nina Turner sort of talking about how Biden is not a great option. I think she compared it to a shit sandwich. So, I mean, there was definitely...
remember who said what anymore?
I mean, a lot of people were saying things. But, yeah, so a lot of, like, who died in the wool Democrats who are like, don't insult our people, you know, we're really angry at that. But it seems like we're sort of moving past that at this point and acknowledging she's definitely the best woman for the job, I think, and she's also going to be really interesting. I think she'll just be very interesting to have her voice in Congress. It's good to have people who want to be
and speaking
loud
of her
and critical.
voice, she's not just loud, she is one of the most gifted public speakers in America. There's no question.
She's fantastic. Yeah.
And Ellie, I would ask you, like, how familiar are the British progressive left with her? You all have seen and liked a million videos that star her, but I wonder if her as a personality or as a separate person, or if it's just sort of, oh, that's the lady who hangs out with Bernie. Like, is there any kind of, like, presence there?
Not really.
I mean, I'm always interested in what people focus on when they're looking at us from other places.
So there's an entire generation of people who I guess are in their late 30s now in British politics, or late 30s, early 40s, who are obsessed with the West Wing. So therefore are like obsessed with American politics.
There was a collective grimace on this side of the pod
there. I mean, I literally, me and my husband decided to watch it in lockdown because I've never seen it before, and I couldn't get through like 3 episodes. I just couldn't. Yeah. It was horrifying. The idea that people in power take it that seriously was horrifying.
I liked it when I was like,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say I liked it when I was like 12. I would watch it with my parents. And now I'm like, yeah, that was a good show about politics for if you're 12 years old.
Yeah. It got you through the Bush years. That's what it was.
I was like, I'm so smart. I understand this show. I'm in middle school.
It was really funny, actually. I watched a few episodes of the show. A friend had showed it, and it was the first time that I had got the idea that and I didn't even know that it existed. I was like, well, they keep showing the people write the speeches. What are the people who make the movies? Like, this is stupid. Like, what about the people who make the movies? It was the first time I actually looked up, like, who makes movies at the White House was because of that. But yeah, no, I mean, it's, trying to get back off the West Wing and onto Nina Turner's race. Like, Jamaä, do you see this? Do you see her personality as changing a fundamental dynamic in what we, of course, call the squad, our version of the mountain? I mean, she is someone who doesn't play ball, kind of famously. Does that give an extra impulse, or does it create a fracture?
I don't think it has any impact. I think she's going to be her own thing that stands apart. I think she is going to try and raise her brand and do the work in the way that she feels she should. Any type of political aspiration, if she is fortunate and she gets to be served and takes over from Marcia Fudge at her seat, the path for her is going to be difficult moving forward because you got a redistricting cycle coming in. I think Ohio's legislature is Republican, and if they're going to act a fool against certain people, the newest person in usually is the one that takes it on the chin. So it is going to be a difficult road for her to hoe. But then again, Republicans like to pack every black person into one district, so she might be okay. So I don't know how those dynamics are going to fly. I don't know what the future holds for her, but I know that it's a rocky future. And if she is going to not only maintain that seat in the future in whatever form it's going to be, she is going to have to raise the level of political sophistication that she's been doing currently.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, I think there's also something to be said for some blunt force, on the House floor these days, especially. I think there's a big audience for it in the Democratic Party, to some extent. A different audience than Ellie's describing who go to the West Wing for.
I mean, there is one thing. Like, if this is a one and done, then she can just go ahead and just burn the house down. You know what I'm saying? I think
she's going to do that either way. I think she's going to be going viral on the regular, doing crazy stuff, like challenging everybody. I'm here for it.
Raise her profile through that, and then she exits out with an MSNBC show. I mean, that is perfectly fine as well. You know what I mean? But like, I think that was a mistake Doug Adams did. He thought that he actually had a chance to win by being moderate there instead of dying on the sword of progressivism, which is probably gave him a lot more afterwards than trying to be like, well, I think I can appeal to these crazy people in the state who thought that a child rapist was a good candidate, but it just didn't work out that way.
All right, jumping across the pond, we had a big breakup. Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, seemingly. Can you tell us a bit about what was an extraordinary television event? It was, 7 hours of deposition of Dominic Cummings, under talking about the COVID vaccine response, throwing the government under the bus, maybe. Can you just walk us through what happened? Because I think people in America sort of saw this was happening, but not really.
Yeah, so it's not sure. Maybe like Rahm Emanuel is maybe like a good equivalent of like not in terms of politics, but in terms of like the position that they're seen to have within an administration
and pushing that sort of you're spring to almost Rahm Emanuel of his GCCC days when he was the architect of
exactly
of the strategy.
Yeah, so that's how he was seen. So basically, the first thing to understand about Dominic Cummings is that he won the Leave campaign in the EU referendum, which was seen as like a no-hoper, and it was sort of assumed that the Remain campaign would win, and he sort of delivered this like quite shock victory with an actually very good but very ruthless campaign that was like had a lot of untruths in it and was not afraid to really whip up people's anxiety, like Islamophobia. But actually really tapped into something real, which was the sort of alienation and felt by so many people in the country. So he's sort of, and then this brilliant playwright wrote a screenplay about him called Brexit: A Very Uncivil War, and he was like the main character, and he was played by Benedict Cumberbatch. So he sort of he's had this kind of mystique since then of this sort
and
of
he is a bit of a character, right? He dresses very casually, even going out of 10 Downing.
Yeah,
he has
so
these glasses and the head.
I've actually met him. I've actually spent some time with him. And yeah, like when I met him, he was wearing like grey sweatpants with like paint stains on them and a bomber hat, and and he's sort of, I could see why because he inspires like real loyalty with his staff, and I could see why, because he was quite curious and like strangely like lacking in ego compared to other people of his level of seniority that I've met. But he was also like quite ruthless and a bit mad as well. So he had all this mystique, and then he was sort of brought into government, and a lot of people I know who are sort of involved in the Labour Party were like upset because they were like, "Oh God, he's going to be really good." But actually, I think
bringing in talent. It's sort of like when Bannon went in to the Trump thing. You were like, "Oh damn!" Like he's going to figure something out.
He's more of I think he is more of a Bannon figure. Although I think he would be like not ideologically. I mean, in terms of the position that he occupied, I think he'd be offended if like you said that about him. But actually, he's not afraid to.
They're both idiosyncratic dressers. There's room for both of them. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. But he's not afraid to flirt with like far right politics if it'll get him what he wants. I'm not saying that he's like an angel. He's not. He's willing to.
He's just not an ideologue.
Yeah, he is, but it's sort of less. It's less sort of fire and brimstone than Biden. It's a bit more populist. He kind of is like ordinary people need to sort of like Westminster. Our political system is fundamentally broken, and we need to sort of like shake it up by like sort of delivering a shock to the system. But like what that often looks like in practice is like quite racist and ruthless campaign tactics, dishonesty, that like sort of really like corrupting the laws of how the government is supposed to work. That's kind of what's been happening in the government. I mean, to be fair to him, it still happens now, even though he's left. But anyway, he went to join the government, became the chief advisor, although apparently his official title is assistant to the Prime Minister or something. But in any case, he was super close to Boris Johnson. And then you probably heard about him breaking lockdown and going off to a
This is the scandal, yeah. This is almost the inciting incident for what puts him in this chair today, yeah.
Yeah, so the amount of views that got was like bigger than the Olympic opening ceremony.
Wait, I don't know about this.
So lay it out for us.
Yeah.
So basically, the context is, in this country, the first lockdown, which happened between like March and June, I want to say, or March and May last year, was like everybody was like really strict. Like it was like you weren't allowed to hang out with anyone else. You could only stay in your house with the people that you lived with. I think at that point even single people couldn't bubble with other people. It was like really strict, and everybody really stuck by it. It was like, you know, if someone went and sat in someone else's garden, that was like shocking, you know. And basically during this time, him and his wife and son were like, I think. Basically, they were seen by an eyewitness, and it was later confirmed that they had gone from London to the north of England, and they'd like taken a sort of tourist walk around this castle in the north of England, in Durham, which is where they were, and it was sort of like this growing scandal every day, and then which eventually he tried to neutralise by coming out and doing this press conference. Which was, watched by like millions and millions of people. Considering it was like just a political advisor speaking to the press, it was crazy how many people watched it. And what he basically said was, it's a long story, but basically he said that he was really unwell and that he'd been driving around Durham to test his eyesight or something like that. It was very silly.
It was the craziest explanation.
Yeah.
It's like you gotta go for it sometimes.
Yeah, so that has made him like quite hated and not trusted by the public. Anyway, like there's an internal power struggle in the top of the government, and he lost, and he left. He got fired, I think, or I don't know whether he left, or I think he left actually, but they said he left. Who knows? But basically, he lost.
It was one of those resignations that everyone knows is a firing. Yeah.
Yeah, basically, and he very poignantly walked out of the front door of Downing Street carrying all of his belongings in a box, even though there's a back entrance where he was obviously photographed by the paparazzi. So, anyway, then various things went wrong in the government, as they always do. There was lots of leaks, basically, and the government, for some reason, decided to blame this on Dominic Cummings, someone who had nothing to lose, who was known for being a bit crazy and ruthless, and also had like a lot of press interest. So his response to this was to go absolutely nuclear and like expose everything that the government has been doing in this, like, what we call it a select committee, which is where MPs kind of depose sort of politicians and other public figures for 7 hours. Where to even start with his revelation? He said at one point that Boris Johnson wanted to be injected with coronavirus live on TV to show that it was harmless.
That was my favorite.
That sounds like an idea that I was about to say. That sounds like an idea Arun would have and suggest to a candidate.
I don't know why Beto wouldn't do it. No, I'm just kidding.
He also said like tens of thousands of people like died unnecessarily. He said Matt Hancock, who's the health secretary, he was like,
and a noted figure in Boris Johnson's cabinet. He's one of the boogeymen people know.
Absolute idiot. But he said he basically said that Matt Hancock should have been fired over at least 20 things. Something like that. So it was just like, I mean, I can barely remember.
He went maximum damage for the jugular over and over again for hours, right?
Yeah. He was like, these people
somewhere where I can watch it.
Oh yes, there is. Yeah, I'm sure that
Let's get a highlight reel on.
I'm pretty sure there'll be like a highlight reel. But
I want a supercut.
Yeah, he basically and he said that he had evidence for all of it, and there was a lot of stuff to do with so care homes. So in this country, care homes. There was like around between 30 and 40,000 deaths in care homes, because basically what was happening was the government, people were being taken into hospital with coronavirus and then being discharged back into their care home with it, and they weren't being tested. So then everybody in the care home would get it and die.
Just immediately. Ugh.
That's kind of what happened with the nursing homes in New York, that Andrew Cuomo covered up and then spent several months writing his book about how good he is at handling coronavirus. So there's basically fantastic leadership.
So basically like that's kind of what he said, was that like because the government had said, we've put a protective ring around care homes so everybody's safe. And he was just like, that just isn't, they'd never happen.
That you're then injecting with virus. So
good
for you. I mean, I think the question that before we move on to Virginia is this, how much does this damage the SS Johnson? I mean, like, will Boris make it through this? I'm totally
really sorry
sure
to
I know
say,
the
not
answer.
at all. It hasn't damaged him at all. There's some
he's
polling
amazing.
out. Yeah, there's some
Trump.
polling.
He's like Trump, the Teflon man.
Yeah. There's some polling out today that shows that the Conservatives are 22 points ahead of Labour. So it hasn't dented their polling at all. And the field work was done after. And the reason for that, I think, from what I know from people who've done polling on it, is that the messenger, so Dominic Cummings himself, is too untrustworthy for people to actually take him seriously. So even though
They're like, that's the guy who said he was going on a driving test.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just testing my eyes.
Yeah.
So it hasn't. I actually, like, on a serious note, I actually think, like, it has done real damage. But what it's done like real damage to, like, people's ability to believe that government can be good and that things can change.
Yeah.
Because actually, it's just like more shit, more lies. More corruption.
They're all crooks. Nobody does anything, et cetera, which usually plays into conservative hands, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so there's a commentator called Ian Dunn in this country. I disagree with him on a lot of stuff because he's like he's in the centre. But he said, like, actually Dominic Cummings has created this situation where, like, nobody trusted the system or believed in it. He was like one of the key players in making that a big part of British politics. This kind of, like, F the system politics. And he like came and gave his testimony, sort of, and what he needed really was the system to work and people to be invested in it for it to have impact. And obviously, like, he's created a situation where it doesn't have impact, and that's like the irony of it. I think that's pretty true.
Yeah. So, turning to the great Commonwealth of Virginia, I think for our European audience that may not be aware that after, Georgia was right on the heels, obviously, but that after a presidential election, one of the first sort of big tests, big elections where people see what's going on is the gubernatorial race in Virginia. It's especially interesting because it's so term limited. And can you just tell us a little bit about the tradition of that, but then immediately tell us who's on the field this time and what you think is going on, and to give our audience a little more, like our own Julia Doubleday, Jamaä's a data campaigner, and has worked for many organizations in that capacity.
Yes, I wear many hats in the Virginia in progressive politics. Nationally known for data, in Virginia, I'm a founder of one of their anchor progressive groups, a co-founder of one of the anchor progressive groups, another chairman and president. That's New Virginia Majority. We do immigrant rights, we do social justice, environmental. It's like the Progressive United Nations in my office. We got everybody there. Virginia and New Jersey are the only two states that have what they call off-cycle elections. This is like after the federal cycle, they're presidential or congressional, then they go ahead. We actually, in the next year, we have statewide high-stakes elections. And in this year, we have all of our statewide leaders, the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general up, as well as the entire state legislature, which is 100 members in the House and 40 members in the Senate. Virginia is the longest continuous state legislature in the country. Basically, when they founded the country, they decided to have a legislature in Virginia, and then they tried to kill all the people of color. That's kind of how we operate in this state and in this country. That's the MO of America. This election is really interesting for a lot of reasons because governors cannot succeed themselves in Virginia. We have Terry McAuliffe, who's actually running to be governor again. He was governor before.
Split terms, right? So he wasn't, and now will be.
Exactly. That's only happened, I think, twice in the history of our state, where somebody who was governor, they had another governor, and then they elected to be governor again. Usually that never happens. And the main reason why Virginia has this unique thing is our governor has unheard of power to do whatever he wants. He has broad appointed power to everything in the state. On top of, the governor can actually amend legislation and send it back to the legislature for them to revoke. Not just veto, he can actually change the entire bill, and if they can't sustain a veto or get it passed, that's it.
I actually know that.
That's a nice gig.
Yeah, it's the governor of Virginia is ridiculously powerful. and that's the reason why we don't let them succeed themselves, because you don't want somebody to be that powerful for too long. They at least had that in their column. And another reason why we have our off years is that we are a remnant of the Bird Machine, which were the Dixiecrats who were racist. He built out a system of patronage off of off-year cycle elections in order to maintain power in Virginia, of which many states emulated throughout the country because racism and America and freedom. So
you're saying that, making it a lower stakes election makes it a fewer voters, and therefore makes it easier to organize the kind of Dixiecrat thing they were doing? What was it? I just want to dig in on the mechanism that you're describing.
Well, that, and they also had this is where you send your people to get work, and your people in these lower stakes elections would all get patronage jobs. In what we have here, like a city accountant,
so using the off years to stack the deck for the on years.
Exactly, and make sure that they're organizing their job. They may be work in the secretary's office of the county, but their really job there is to do all the politicking. So that is one of their remnants. We don't do it that way because now it's illegal. Thank you, Hatch Act and other things. But as a corollary and offshoot of that, because we have off-year elections, our campaign finance rules are basically non-existent in comparison to other states. I used to joke early on, when it was really ridiculous, that I could actually take a nuclear weapon from Russia and write it down as an in-kind donation, and it would be cool in Virginia. That's how ridiculous our campaign finance laws were.
Cool if you did.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's funny that we were talking, and Ellie, even from her perspective, was like, Virginia's pretty reliably Democratic now, and you immediately said, no, it's not. Can you dig into that a little more, and also talk about this last time Terry McAuliffe ran? It was against Ken Cuccinelli, right? Who is so conservative. He is against heterosexual oral sex, which is not a winning argument, in an election.
Absolutely bonkers. And to your point, when you said that, that's not the only thing that he's against, though. And I'll go into our weird laws in Virginia that just recently got changed. But when she said that statement about it's reliably blue, I said, no, we're a knife fight in the phone booth every year. It is high touch, stabby, and there's blood in the streets every year. You're fighting it out, because even in those quote blue elections statewide, we're only winning these things by 50 and 60 and 30,000 votes a year. We're not blowing people out by 200 and 500,000 votes. These things are super close.
It's a big state. There's a lot of people there.
A lot of people, and it's it's the Republicans are usually winning, and then we wait for Fairfax County to come in that's reliably blue to hopefully bring us over the line, and maybe Petersburg, Virginia, which takes forever for them to count because reasons. But yeah, Terry McAuliffe beat Ken Cuccinelli, who was a blood-spitting conservative, in the most horrible way possible. So terrible that Trump thought he would be a good Department of Homeland Secretary, person, because he hates people. Exactly. I like the venom that he spits. And so he brought him in there. But not only that, it was true that he felt that, non-procreative sex in a specific way was the devil. He was one of the few people that were objecting when we wanted to change our blue laws, which in Virginia, up until I think maybe 10 or 20 years ago, it was illegal to have any sex in the state that wasn't procreative for sex, and specifically only missionary.
Ellie's face is so funny right now. Yeah, we have. Okay, I don't know where the term blue law comes from, but there is this. Yeah, there is this term blue law in the U.S. where it's there's a blue law in Ohio, which is why we couldn't have sorority houses in Ohio, which is you can't have a certain number of single women living in a building without men or something. It's really, really outdated laws, and people don't really follow them, but they still are.
They are on the books.
Yeah,
exactly. And it wasn't. Go ahead.
What if you have sex without using contraception in the missionary position, but you don't conceive?
If you
wrong.
It was in your mind if you wanted.
I think it's the attempt
from
that
Jesus. then yes, yeah, then
I
that's
don't
fine.
even want to tell
They
you
need
what a
to
certain
know-
senatorial candidate Indiana said about biological mechanisms of women. I can't, like that. We're not
Yeah.
going to do that this time.
And the really messed up part of our laws, it wasn't that he said this thing or nothing. They literally itemized all the things that were linked. And at the time, I believe I was working in the Senate
They were
desk.
like looking it
and
up
I'm-
of like porn
Yeah, I'm
sites.
like, what is
else
that?
can you do? Huh.
That's the first time I heard the word anal lingo, and I looked it up on like the Senate website, and I think their blockers didn't allow me to look up some of the terms that they were actually going to like.
Who was
make-
the intern that had to do this research? I'm interested.
Like typing it in, like with gloves on.
It's like
Definitely
it's so
don't like
All right, but we don't have Ken Cuccinelli this time. So do we have like a sensible businessy guy Republican, and are you worried about that?
Oh no, he's a terrible person. So the other guy, and this is where it gets really crazy. So the guy, they had this.
So this is where it gets
convention.
crazy, folks. Stick with
Sorry,
it.
it gets crazy. Virginia's bonkers. So Glenn Youngkin won in the convention, and the Republicans there who have been beating this drum about voting rights and we need voter IDs did not know how to implement their own convention rules because they couldn't figure out the ID requirement that was in fact less than what they wanted everybody in Virginia to adhere to because they're crazy as shit. And then on top of that, we had him. So there was like this whole like outsider thing. There were some insurgents in there who were like Amanda Chase, who I was rooting for because she said she's Trump in heels and she's equally as ridiculous of a person. I was like, I want this batshit crazy person in there because that's good comedy. It's like, I want this there. And she has no chance because even the Republicans would like try to sink her. But what happened was the sane people prevailed because it was a convention and the vote counting was not as transparent as you would expect. The guy they got is a guy named Glenn Youngkin who recently retired from, I shit you not, the Carlyle Group. And while he spent 25 years there, so he was there in their entire span of like growing them into this fucked up military industrial complex behemoth. But what he is best known for is screwing over Taylor Swift. He is the one that forced her to re-record all of her masters because he bought them in some kind of like...
Oh, it's that guy. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm like, we're literally sitting there like, how do we recruit Taylor Swift in a video to go fuck
Yeah,
you?
no, it sounds like there's
This is an
definitely-
open invitation to Taylor Swift right now. This is a message to Taylor
Yeah.
Swift.
Exactly.
Come on
So,
the
like,
show.
bump
Come on
you
the
get.
show.
Yeah.
shit on Glenn Youngkin, that guy. And so we have this, and so that's on the Republican side. And then their lieutenant governor candidate is a black woman named Winsome Sears, who I thought was gone, and she is an interesting character. Let me put it that way. She's like posing on her yard sign, which apparently for all GOP people now, you must have an AR-15 in your arms. Not a baby, not anything attractive. Like if you're not there with a posable gun that could kill lots of people, you aren't appropriately GOP enough. And so she's doing that crazy shit, and I don't even know who their AG person is because I didn't
So
want to.
they're
go
not
far
changing
into
the strategy. The Republican Party in Virginia is going for it again and running, very ideologically conservative and questionable sanity people.
Well, if Glenn Youngkin's ads are really, really good, and he's thanking himself on the whole business tip, and he's self-funding, so he solves a lot of problems that they have with he's trying to like fly over the whole Trump thing, try to get back to the business bona fides, and he's trying to say that we have moved the state too far left with our, getting rid of the death penalty and making marijuana legal like everybody else. Somehow that is like too much, and giving like poor people health care. That apparently is too conservative, but go figure. And so
Go ahead, Julia.
Oh, I was just going to say, so is he like actively distancing himself from Trump or like not mentioning him, or is it just sort of,
he's trying to be like, they're trying to go to the whole we're post-Trump now conversation. But here's the thing, it's like you're in a trick bag because he still has Trump still has a critical mass of support that is ideologically 100% on board with him, that exists in the state that they need to win. But he can't adhere to him because after Corey Stewart and a host of other people, Trumpism without Trump does not work. We were the first state to show that was an actual thing, because Corey Stewart wanted to run for governor, and he was like, I am 100% on board with all this Trump shit, and then that didn't work. Also, we had like Charlottesville and a guy running a car and a whole bunch of people that kind of was, you know, a precursor to the January 6th, you know, insurrection. Is like people are getting violent and murdered.
Cristina likes to do things on off years. They really do. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it didn't fly, but we're seeing him trying to, this is their first attempt to cobble back, yet to build some sort of a coalition that is going to be a natural tension with itself, like, let's get back the business interests, let's get back the conservative, the pro-lifers, the evangelicals, the conservative right, and this Trump wing of the party, and I need to marry it and somehow get to some measure of independence to side with me over what people presume to be either Terry McAuliffe or Jennifer McClellan, Jennifer Carroll Foy, Justin Fairfax, Lee Carter, and a host of other people. You know, and there's a lot of people.
Well, in the last 2 minutes, can you tell us a little bit about that? Is Terry McAuliffe an inevitability? And is there, do the progressives have any chance in coalescing around someone? I think we don't have enough time to get into the current lieutenant governor and gubernatorial scandals and problems.
You want to go in there, but yeah. So you have Terry McAuliffe, who's riding high name recognition, and everybody thinks he is the presumptive favorite.
He's a Clinton fundraiser back in the day, just for
exactly. Yeah, he has more money than God. He's like the guy who can raise a lot of money, and he's a known quantity because he was governor before.
He puts out that energy. He looks like a fundraiser, you know, skinny
absolutely.
guy in a suit, kind of. Yeah.
He is good for a drink if you're ever with him. And the only reason I think he's running is because he didn't get his, ambassadorship to Ireland, which he always wanted. And then you have the progressive community is actually split between Jennifer Carroll Floyd and Jennifer McClellan. Both of these are African-American women who are running for governor. Jennifer McClellan is seen more of the establishment type person. She is a Verizon lawyer, but she has been loyal and has passed a slew of really progressive bills and legislation and gotten Virginia to where she is now. Jennifer Carroll Foy is a much more fiery progressive on the stump, and she has a lot less of a record, but she has been electrifying on the stump and saying all the right things to progressive, like, you know, we're going to do get rid of right to work and all this other stuff, so much so that the outside of the state has been supporting her heavily, and she got to an early fundraising advantage. And then you have Justin Fairfax, who I think just wants to meet people, who's still kind of, we don't know why he's running because sexual assault and all the other stuff, and Lee Carter because reasons. And then you have an independent who was the sister of Marcus David Peters, the person who got killed, and she wants to run and do criminal justice reform, independent. And that's where we are with that situation, with the field portion of the progressive movement in the state backing Jennifer McClellan, and the greater progressive community outside of the state backing Jennifer Carroll Foy, and with the establishment by and large mostly backing Terry and slightly backing Jennifer McClellan. So that's where the situation is right there.
Your prediction probably will be that McClellan drives up. That McAuliffe.
McAuliffe wins, but I think Jennifer McClellan has a punching chance. She actually has a real shot, depending on GOTV, field, and turnout.
Cool. Maybe when we find out more about that, we can let our viewers know if any of them want to get involved in that race. I'm sure this will be one where the phones get pretty crazy by the end. Who knows?
Yes.
Jamaä Bickley-King, Ellie Mae O'Hagan, Julia Doubleday, thank you for being here. This was a good one. I feel like we learned a lot of disgusting things.
Oh, yes, especially about Virginia law. That stuff is legal now. You can totally do it now. Just trust me.
The overpass. Dear Editor, I wish to call your attention to a very unsafe situation which exists in the new part of our town. Many times every day the residents here, over 1,000 people, use 3 unprotected train tracks as a crossing. This has led to many accidents, some resulting in death. We have spoken of this problem at a number of community meetings and are very dissatisfied with the attitude of the authorities. Although I am not an engineer, and my suggestion is only that of an ordinary citizen, I think the situation could be remedied by the immediate construction of a concrete or metal overpass or some other kind of pedestrian crossing. In this way, our elected officials would truly be serving the interests of the people. Sincerely yours, Martha Jacopo.
In the old days, when you tried to coup something and you messed it up, it was understood that you weren't allowed to live. It was sort of like tenure. It's like, hey, you're either going to teach here forever or you have to leave. It's not like you can just not achieve tenure. It's like, no, now we're all going to feel weird, so we got to get rid of you. I feel like, in whether it's, what's his name? The Beto O'Rourke guy in Venezuela, Guaido, or, or the folks who, played fast and loose in Bolivia. The old-fashioned consequences aren't there. I don't wish death on anyone, but I do think there was a certain accountability we don't see anymore. Welcome to your Global News Rodeo, a segment where we go do a quick roundup of some world events as curated by our own Forrest Lovette. Item 1. Renters Unite. Berliners seek control over housing. Jacobin reports that Deutsche Wohnen and Company in Teigen, the Berlin-based movement, has amassed nearly 200,000 signatures. The organization's fight is to expropriate major housing companies like Deutsche Wohnen and Company. The signatures surpass the 170,000 threshold needed to force a referendum. The residents will now vote on whether to initiate all necessary measures for the transfer of real estate and land into public ownership for the purpose of socialization in accordance with Article 15 of the Basic Law. What this means, this would socialize 240,000 housing units in Berlin that are currently controlled by real estate corporations. Good news for Berlin if it happens. Jockeying for position. Biden and Putin search for meeting location. Politico Europe reports numerous countries vying to host the summit between U.S. Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin. The news coverage of the meeting will bring global news coverage for at least 24 hours and give the host country bragging rights. President Biden plans to hold talks when he travels to Europe in mid-June. The most likely choices are Austria, Switzerland, or Finland. Other potential places are Iceland, Czech Republic, Slovenia, and Azerbaijan. No matter the locale, the two leaders have a lot to discuss, from the war in Ukraine to the expulsion of American diplomats and retaliation to U.S. sanctions to necessary climate action. Azerbaijan is a little bit like all of them are sort of traditional Cold War spots, and they're like, or Azerbaijan. I actually hope they don't have it in Azerbaijan. I'll be very honest with you. That was nasty business with Armenia. Item 3, Bolivian bribery. Former cabinet minister arrested. Al Jazeera is reporting the United States has arrested Arturo Murillo, former cabinet minister of Bolivia's ex-president Jeanine Áñez. The U.S. Department of Justice has accused Murillo of receiving bribes paid by a U.S. company and individuals to secure a Bolivian government contract and then using the U.S. financial system to launder those bribes. Charming. Murillo was also wanted on sedition charges in Bolivia, but fled the country before the arrest warrant. He and other 4 associates are facing up to 20 years in prison if they are convicted. Item 4, Flight of the Damned. Blogger arrested after commercial flight grounded. Deutsche Welle reports Germany and the EU were demanding answers following the unexpected grounding of the Ryanair commercial flight to Minsk this past week. The flight was en route to Vilnius, Lithuania from Athens when a fighter jet intercepted its path, forced the plane to land. It was the first reported to be a potential bomb threat on board, but that explanation was quickly ruled out when at least 4 passengers did not reboard following those inspections. Among those removed from the flight was blogger Roman Protasevich, who had been critical of Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said on Twitter, the outrageous and illegal behavior of the regime in Belarus will have consequences. Those responsible for the Ryanair hijacking must be sanctioned. And the journalist Roman Protasevich must be released immediately. And I will say, we also had a member of the American progressive community jailed in Belarus during the unrest there for many months with really not very much explanations. And this is something that what is hardening and crystallizing there is something that really should be of concern to all of us. Item 5, abandoned ship. Politicians leave Silvio Berlusconi's party Forza Italia. The party of former Italian PM Berlusconi is seeing its members leave en masse. Politico Europe reports a new center-right political force, Coraggio Italia, has emerged and is to blame for the defections. Created by the mayor of Venice, Luigi Brugnaro, Coraggio now has 24 MPs and 7 senators, 11 of which hail from Berlusconi's party. According to recent polls, Forza has now only 7%, compared to 14% in 2018. Berlusconi's poor health following a battle with COVID-19 has played a big factor in waning support and further complicates the 84-year-old's future in politics. Trickle-down Central America style. The U.S. government once again rallies behind big business. NPR is reporting that Vice President Kamala Harris met with business leaders last Thursday to discuss investing in the Northern Triangle, which consists of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. The main goal is to address some of the root causes of immigration from the region. Some of the guests were CEOs of Nespresso, Giovanni, Duolingo, the chairman of MasterCard, and the president of Microsoft. Harris spoke at the event saying, when we work together, when we combine resources, limited though they are for each one of us, we can maximize that potential to give people in the region hope. And in that way also show what it means to be a good neighbor. And sometimes, to editorialize on this in the words of the show's own Julia Doubleday from our previous segment just a couple minutes ago, sometimes you have to wonder if the United States is a real country or a bunch of corporations in a trench coat. My German teacher canceled on me today, and so if people expect me to get the German right, I have another thing coming. I went to my German class, and the woman, didn't even recognize me anymore. It was already, hard enough, but now, with the haircut, how do I say to my German teacher so that classes will be better? How do I say I got a haircut?
Okay. Ich habe mir...
Ich habe... Because it's first person. See, I do study.
Yeah, and I have myself. So ich habe mir...
Ich habe mir...
Die Haare...
Schneiden...
lassen.
Die Haare schneiden lassen.
Ja, ich habe mir die Haare
Ich habe mir... Yeah, what was the last thing?
Mir. M-I-R.
Ich habe mir...
Die Haare...
Schneiden...
lassen.
Regional conditions. Your local 36-hour forecast from the National Weather Service. Your local 36-hour forecast from the National Weather Service. Local 36-hour forecast from the National Weather Service. Extended forecast. The extended forecast. The extended forecast. Regional conditions.
En los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Komitee, Komitato, Comitiet, Comiteto.
Dear Editor, I was very pleased with the new pedestrian overpass above the railroad tracks. It was completed in record time. But those of us who were in favor of building the walkway are now upset by a new turn of events. It's true that we don't have a children's playground. Still, it just isn't logical that an overpass which costs so much money should serve as a playground, while adults still cross the tracks as before. It's impossible to understand how people can play with their lives this way. I request that the authorities take all necessary steps to instruct the citizenry in the proper use of the overpass. Sincerely yours, Martha Jacopo.
Hi, and welcome back to the committee program with me, Arun Chaudhary, your host. And today we are actually talking about Podemos, who is, a left-wing populist party in Spain that really captured the imagination of U.S. campaigners. I was just telling our panel, sort of after 2016, when that first wave of Bernie folks went over into Europe. But anyway, let's dig in. I think there's a lot to talk about. So this last May 4th, Pablo Iglesias, the Secretary General and founder of anti-austerity populists, if this word still means anything, party Podemos in Spain, quit politics, stepping down from all of his posts. Previously, he was not just the founder of this party, but a figure of the left, a media personality, and part of the rising anti-austerity movement that had been capturing Spanish imagination. Podemos also caught the imagination of the international left, but after a tough electoral showing in the party's stronghold of Madrid, Iglesias, before cutting his famously long hair, said, "I will stay committed to this country, but I do not want to block a renovation of leadership." He said, "When a person is no longer useful, they have to know when to quit." But that sort of begs the question, what was the utility and is the utility of the Podemos project? How did it change the landscape of Spanish and European politics? And where does it fit into the history of national and international progressive politics? With us to discuss Podemos, our friend of the show, Paolo Gerbaudo, sociologist and senior lecturer in digital culture and society at King's College London, and author of the upcoming The Great Recoil, Politics After Populism and Pandemic. Dr. Cristina Fominaya, reader in social politics and media at Loughborough University, editor-in-chief of the Social Movement Studies Journal, and author of Democracy Reloaded, Inside Spain's Political Laboratory from 15M to Podemos. And Jorge Rosina, lecturer of political science at the Complutense University of Madrid, which is where Pablo was also a teacher, right? Yeah. And is the vice dean of the Faculty of Political Science and Sociology. I suppose you all have his picture up in the faculty lounge. But Cristina, let's start with you. So, like I said, most U.S. progressives will not have heard of Podemos until that first wave. But the story begins a bit earlier in 2014 at the founding, and even before that, obviously, with the kind of rise of austerity and anti-austerity in Latin America. But I'll let you. What can you tell us about the origin story and how this space on the Spanish left was unoccupied?
The origin story has to start with the 15M movement, known internationally more as the Indignados movement or the outrage movement, that took the squares of the city, especially starting in Madrid with the mass camp. And that was a movement for real democracy now. And the movement was pro-democracy and also anti-austerity. So those were the two twin pillars, if you will, of what they were going for. And the movement mobilized millions of Spaniards, transformed public opinion, kicked off a debate about democracy. It was just an absolutely remarkable wave of mobilization from about 2011 to 2013. Then we start to see a little bit of a dropping off of mobilization. And that's when Podemos's founders decide that there's a political opportunity that hasn't been channeled or exploited. And the reason I say this is that despite the fact that millions of people were mobilizing and demanding change, neither of the established parties, neither the Socialist Party or the Popular Party, which is a right-wing party, had responded in any meaningful way to the demands for democratic reform, greater transparency. They were just carrying on with austerity politics pretty much as usual. And Podemos saw an opportunity to try to take that disenfranchised citizenship, that voter potential, and flip it around. But they were, who were they? They were just a couple of media personalities. They were longtime activists. They were friends and people who knew each other from the university. They were very plugged into activist networks. And so they knew that they needed the support of the movement to be able to channel the spirit of the movement. So they were kind of capitalizing on the 15M spirit and energy and the massive influence that movement had. And so they did that in very specific and very strategic ways. First of all, by trying to make sure that they were appealing to the political culture of the movement and the demands of the movement, and presenting themselves as something that was synergistic with the movement's principles. Why did they have to do that? Because the movement was an anti-established party movement, and it said, politicians do not represent us, we want real democracy now. So Podemos had to say, well, we are going to kind of represent, but we're not really going to represent because we really, so they had to navigate that movement identity or collective identity and political culture and find a way to convince people that they wouldn't be giving up on their autonomous principles, they wouldn't be giving up on their demands for real democracy now, even if they supported an electoral or representative party. So that's kind of by way of just giving you the background to when they sort of enter onto the scene. There's much more we can say, but yeah.
No, certainly. I mean, Jorge, how would you say that the traditional center-left, I think probably represented by the Socialist Workers' Party at that time, lost the movement, as Cristina describes them, because that is a different thing, especially American politics. People will recognize that.
Yeah, well, because in Spain we have PSOE, that is the typical and classical social democrat European party. The problem is that in the last decades, the social democratic ideology, especially in Europe, has been losing its influence, and it doesn't answer the problems. For example, the crisis that we had in 2011, because people, especially my generation, felt the crisis as a kind of scam, fraud, so they need another kind of response. And I think that, as Cristina said, Podemos was really strategic to channel the social movements and the social energy that 15M had. I think that the problem is what was the kind of answer that after a while Podemos has given. Because if you analyze now, currently, we have a problem. Maybe it's not an exclusive problem in Spain, it's a general problem, especially in the south of Europe. Because if you think 7 years ago, we had a kind of left wave, and now we are living a counter wave with far-right political parties who are reframing the consequences of the crisis. And this is worrying, because now, for example, in Portugal, we have Chega with André Ventura. In Italy, we have, of course, Lega Norte, but also we have Fratelli with Meloni. Of course, in France, we have Le Pen, that is inspired all these parties in some sense. And in Spain, we have Vox. And now, even in the electoral results, Vox has won more successful results than Podemos. So this is worrying, and I think that we have to reflect about the kind of answers that leftist movements gave to people, because something was wrong. I don't know what. I think that is not a clear answer, and we have to reflect. But what is sure is that, okay, social democrat doesn't have the response, doesn't have the answer, but neither these new social movements or new parties that were created around 2014, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly. And Paolo, I want to ask you about that moment in 2014 and expand on what Jorge is saying on a bit. You know, this is a moment where we have Syriza in Greece, where we have the Five-Star Movement really starting to win elections and show themselves to be a force. I mean, how much do you think this is part of a European moment, and how much is this an indigenous Spanish push? That's a big question, but I think you can help us out.
I think it's partly both things, in the sense that there was this sense of a purple wave paralleling the pink wave in Latin America. So there was the time in which the generation of 2011, the Indignados in Spain, and the Aganaktismeni, the Greek Indignados in Greece, and people in other countries were really looking with a lot of hope to this left renewal. And then shortly after, in 2015, obviously Jeremy Corbyn becomes the leader of the Labour Party. So there was really this big sense of renewal, of possibility of doing something, of changing something. But it's also something that is really specific to Spain and to the miracle of the Indignados, which is a movement that has no equals in terms of its breadth, its strength, its popular support. I mean, it's more than Occupy Wall Street, right? I mean, imagine Occupy Wall Street redoubled or in much greater form. So what happened there was a movement that at some point 70% support of the population. It had a huge popular sympathy and a level of territorial capillarity which was huge, even in the kind of most remote pueblo of Castilla. You could find a small assembly, perhaps 3 people, right? But it was really a movement that was rooted everywhere. And Podemos precisely tries to draw lessons from this movement. And the fundamental lesson is, how comes that so many people are angry with neoliberalism, with austerity, with the present model of capitalism, and the left that has been voicing this critique for such a long time only gets few percentage points in the elections, right? So it demonstrated that movement was both a vindication of the criticism of neoliberalism, of austerity, that the left alone conducted, and demonstration of its irrelevance. And therefore, it was calling for something different that would overcome the reasons why the radical left, while having the right analysis, was not able to translate that into electoral consensus.
something different is great until you put pen to paper, of course. Cristina, again, can you tell us sort of what the actual party program that emerges as they become a real party crystallizes into?
Let me answer a slightly different question, because my brain is tracking back to this origin story, and I'm picking up on what Paolo was saying. I think what's really important for people to understand is we are now talking about this in terms of left and in terms of right. Mm-hmm. But what 15M managed to do, and it did again this very strategically, was to frame the movement as a movement of citizens, not as a movement of leftist activists or progressives. So that 70% is so remarkable because the historical cleavages between left and right in Spain are absolutely deeply rooted, and they go back decades and decades and decades. So to be
it's
able
a fresh
to
and painful history,
Yes, and to be able to actually join, I mean, if you say 70%, that means that voters of the Popular Party were supporting the demands of the movement. Now think how remarkable that is, especially if you think about the United States right now and the level of polarization. Imagine right now that I could say, well, there's a movement that mobilizes, 70% of people, including all across the board from Democrats to Republicans. That's remarkable. So that initial stance of we aren't on the left, we aren't on the right, is very much what the Greens did in Germany when they came out. We're neither on the left or the right, we're out in front, we're trying to do something different. We're trying to answer global problems, global challenges in a different way. That's what the Greens said. And Podemos came out saying, we're different, we're like 15M, we're trying to solve citizens' welfare. We want to take care of our people. We want to reclaim the nation for its citizens. And that is really just a continuation of a narrative that the 15M movement itself developed very powerfully, to say we want to reclaim democratic institutions for the citizens. And in my work, that's what I refer to as the democratic turn. So it's when these autonomous movements really start to rethink the relationship with the state, with institutions, and with democracy in a much more explicit and outward-facing way than they had up until then. So Podemos had to present itself as a citizen. It didn't present itself as a party initially. It said it was a citizens' initiative. And only if the people agreed and a sufficient number of people expressed their approval would they continue down this line of sort of trying to create some kind of electoral initiative, and they kept it all very vague. And so in the beginning, they really tried to not be very programmatic. And this is why I'm giving you all this background to your answer, because the minute you're programmatic, you start blocking people out. If you start declaring your position on the environment, on rights, women's rights, or whatever the case may be, immediately people start going, wait a minute, I agree with that, or I don't agree with that. But if you say it's participatory, then everyone's hopes and dreams and illusions can just be kind of laid at the altar of this new project, right? And that's really what happened. So they said, the 15M movement was organized in assemblies, mostly organized in assemblies, which in autonomous politics are horizontal, without leaders, deliberation, participation, collective intelligence, collective action. Mm-hmm. And so Podemos created what they called the circles, the Podemos circles, which were supposed to kind of be the Podemos version of the 15M assemblies. And nobody was really clear what exactly those circles were going to do, how that was going to actually channel into party decision-making. All of that was kind of left nebulous. So on the one hand, you have this really nebulous kind of articulation of the project. But on the other hand, you have Pablo Iglesias as a very highly visible media personality who's recognizable, who's a brilliant orator, absolutely brilliant orator, very charismatic, very intelligent, lots of loyal supporters and so on in his kind of immediate group, right? And so they were playing with both of those things. They were galvanizing the movement support and convincing activists to help support that project. And without the activists, they wouldn't have gone anywhere because there were like 5 people. and on the other hand, really mobilizing and very strategically using the visibility of Iglesias himself to translate that into votes, and his media presence, because he was constantly on, people noticed very early on that when he was on these political debate shows, we call them in Spain tertulias, which it's like everybody shouts and talks to each other.
Right.
And when he would go on, he wouldn't shout, he wouldn't do the thing that most people did, but he would be so prepared with really compelling arguments. And what the news realized very quickly was that their audience share was going up significantly when he was on the panel. And so then he was able then to get into news channels that wouldn't normally be interested in necessarily having a progressive voice, because they were looking for that for once capitalism works for something, right? They were looking for that audience share. And so that's kind of the scenario, if you will, of when they're coming onto the scene.
And Jorge, let me ask you, just as they're, again, sort of maturing a bit, they are forming this broader coalition, and there's, Unidos Podemos. Can you sort of explain that phase of the operation?
Yes, but, I think that I would like to say before one thing about Podemos and the tendency that Podemos has had, because I think that it's a general problem everywhere. First, when you have a movement that create a huge expectation, after a while you have a lot of people who are frustrated, or at the end you are losing the support. And I think that this is really clear in the case of Podemos, and it's something that happens in general. And the other general tendency everywhere is that there is a general problem when you are a movement and you want to go from the street to the institutions. And I think that this is really problematic, especially in the left spectrum. I think that the problem inside Podemos was that people expect to have a new kind of democratic instrument, with circles, more horizontal making decision process, another kind of politics, But after a while, in this transition from the street to the institutions, Podemos turns to be a classical political party.
More ordinary political party.
Yeah, absolutely. With the typical structure and, for example, with some Cesarism in the structure with Pablo Iglesias, because it's true, he's absolutely charismatic, he's a leader, but he is also a controller. So the problem is that people start to see him as a problem, and something that is something not new, is something that people had seen before with other political parties. So people start to lose confidence in Podemos, and the other problem was that in theory Podemos was, and Paolo knows, in theory Podemos was a kind of digital party, but the problem is that they are not anymore. If you even check its website, it's really poor.
Yeah. No, even at the height, right? They weren't doing, like, the Rousseau was engaged with constantly by the Cinque Stelle, and there was not an equivalent for Podemos, right? This was a much more pen to paper party.
Yeah, that's the point. And they have a kind of plebiscitarian style with internal referendum. So this is not really new. I think that people were not looking for this. So this is a problem. So let's see now what is happening in the transitional process inside of Podemos, because maybe the problem is not just to have a new leader. The problem is how to make this process. If this process is more democratic, or this process is just changing one leader for another, because now it's supposed to be Ione Belarra, maybe the next leader of Podemos, but everyone knows that Ione Belarra is really close to Pablo Iglesias and Irene Montero. So this is a problem, because people, or it seems as is more of the same strategy. So, these few people are trying to control their own political party. So that's the problem. When you have a new instrument, and at the end, this instrument is just a party for a few,
And I think it goes back to Cristina's point about mapping left to right versus elites versus citizens is, perhaps a huge part of the problem. Paolo, I want to ask you a little bit more about what went wrong, but actually just first, Jorge, while we have you, and we're talking about, can you actually surface some of the other personalities or notable candidates, or what are the kinds of folks who Podemos is running, and do they in any way seem different, right? Like, your Cinque Stelle candidates, for instance, in Italy are, were often smart technocratic folks who didn't even sort of know what the head of the party was saying or if they would be fired by them the next day. I don't think it's the same for Podemos, but tell me some of the characters.
I think the political personnel of each party is always an interesting thing to study. And indeed, in the case of the Five-Star Movement, you will find a lot of technical or scientific personnel, which I think is quite interesting. Actually, despite being considered as ignorant by other parties, they had more degrees than other parties, and they were kind of computer experts, biologists, engineers, and stuff. In the case of Podemos, at least the first elections that they surveyed, because, let's remember, I think it's something very important for our audience. The context is it's a political system in Spain that has been through, I think, a total of 5 elections in the last 7 years.
Yeah.
It's snap election after snap election, which is the greatest symptom of organic crisis of democracy. When a system doesn't manage to form governments, right, is a very basic kind of measure of crisis. But so, say, at least in the first elections, if you look at the MPs Podemos elected, you would find many people like me, Cristina, and Jorge, like many academics, like many political scientists, which was quite interesting, actually, I think, because there was a new generation of academics that were ready to kind of, in a way, bet on these, often also kind of risking a bit their career prospect in the process, which anyway were already very slim career prospects for the generation, especially in Spain. Then many activists from the Indignados movement, people I met in the squares in 2011, and then met them again as MPs 4 years later, and it was quite amazing because you could really see like people in their 20s, right? People who didn't yet have a steady job and were projected into an institutional sphere with a lot of energy and a lot of also knowledge from the streets, and being able to convert it into policies, into institutional action. There were some people drawn from Izquierda Unida. Iglesias himself, right, initially was connected to that. Partly his candidacy was also, in a way, a protest against the fact that Izquierda Unida would not run him as a candidate. Other people, such as Sanchez, such as many other kind of high and mid-level figure of Podemos were also from Izquierda Unida, but also precisely because they thought that Izquierda Unida had inherent limits, was not able to break out of left identitarianism, right? Speaking to the same 5%, 6% of people who have a hammer and sickle flag in their bedroom, whatever. So that is partly, but the interesting thing is that Iglesias also managed to recruit people that you would never think would join a radical left party. For example, a former general, right? There was basically the kind of candidate for Minister of Defense. People even originally from the right, as Verstringe. So it was able to broaden out a bit. But yeah, and also he started questioning how it could attract pensioners' votes, for example, that always remain kind of out of the picture. And he tried to do certain things, but he never really managed to completely break out from that image of being the party of youth and the graduates, in a way. I think there was a limit of the political personnel, but also the kind of electoral appeal, ultimately, of the movement.
And so, we did, and I think even a lot of our audience will be familiar with the constant failure to form coalition governments, and there was the Socialists and Podemos. Cristina, can you walk us through how they were as a coalition partner when all of a sudden it becomes time to sort of not be the kids, but be kind of the mature, grown-up, whatever it is? How did that shake out?
Do you mean in the joining the national government? You mean?
Yeah, during the
government with the Socialist Party.
Yeah.
I mean that whole process was extremely fraught and difficult, and resulted in them the government not coming into office with as many seats as it would have if Sanchez and Iglesias had been able to reach an agreement in the first time they were called to form a government. So they would have been in a much stronger position to do that. And I think that was an extremely damaging moment. I mean, there's a couple damaging moments for Podemos, I think. For me, personally, my analysis is that the biggest mistake Podemos ever made was joining as a coalition with Izquierda Unida. I think that the minute that they did that, they lost any ability to tell Spanish people that they were doing something new, that they weren't about old left and right. Izquierda Unida has been around for ages. It's an old left party, even if it has a young and charismatic leader. It's been, it had corruption scandals with the Tarjetas Black scandal, which was a whistleblowing scandal about political corruption of political leaders and trade union leaders. So that moment for me, and I know that Iglesias held out for a long time against it. And what's really, really interesting is if you look at the results of Podemos, since that moment, their results have gone worse and worse and worse every election. And they have never managed, even with, to surpass, they've never managed to have a greater sum than the individual parts. So the most they've managed to do is to take the vote that Izquierda Unida would have had on its own and their vote on its own and put them together. But they've never managed to do more than that. So that's kind of by way of saying that there's been a real decline in support and electoral support for a lot of reasons we can talk about. Going into this first round in April of 2019, when they were supposed to be forming a government with PSOE. And I think there was a lot of issues there where Pedro Sanchez didn't want another charismatic leader in his government. He didn't want to be overshadowed by Iglesias, and I think that that's always been an issue. This sort of alpha male, competition. And so he said some very nasty things about Podemos. Podemos, on their part, was very much kind of taking the line, like saying, we have red lines which we will not cross. And our purpose is to change Spanish society and politics and not to become a member of government at any cost. So they were thinking that that was going to be, boost their legitimacy in the eyes of the electorate. But what ended up happening is that people were so annoyed at having to go for another round of elections that in fact both parties lost support and credibility. And what we end up having is an absolute massive boost in extreme right party representation in that election, and a drop in seats for Podemos from 42 that they had in the first election of 2019 down to 35. So, we've gone from...
And to you, this is quite simply that the dissatisfied and the disaffected have a new home, a new place to go to, which is the right.
Well, I mean, it's not that simple, right? Because that is coming. We have to understand that there's a shifts in the media ecology, even from the time that Podemos is created in 2014 to these elections in 2019. We're seeing all across Europe, all across the world, the absolute damage that information disorders are doing to democracy, the way that the extreme right has very effectively and strategically weaponized information disorders. So that's having effects on, progressive candidates and progressive parties all over the place. But in Spain, there's two things that Podemos has had to really deal with, which no other party has had to deal with. The first is the relentless onslaught of right-wing media against the party and against the figure of Iglesias, like just constant. and they bring spurious court cases. They're just constantly doing anything. So that's one huge challenge to try to overcome in a world where media is like shaping people's opinions all the time. But the other thing is that because all the other established parties and even new parties saw Podemos as their primary threat, their whole their party programs really in these elections were reduced to one thing: not Podemos. Like, they wouldn't even bother trying to present any kind of a program. It was just, whatever you do, don't vote for Podemos. So in that kind of a context, it was, that I think also we have to take into consideration that is going to have an impact on your voting, on your votes. But there are also things that were happening internally that that affected those votes as well. But so, by way of answering your actual question, by the time they come into the actual government, I think that both sides have learned their lesson, that they can't mess about anymore. They're terrified of what they're seeing Fox's results, and they get down to trying to actually support each other and act like a coalition government is supposed to act. Internally, there's lots of disputes, but you say de cara a la galería, like facing out to the public, even though there are spats and things that go back and forth, they also try to express unity and being a serious partner. And I think they had a really strong influence on, for example, ensuring that the response to the COVID crisis was handled completely differently than the response to the global financial crisis of 2008. So I think we can say that they really did have a significant impact on Spanish citizens' well-being. And I think they still are having that impact. And certainly, even just their role in raising the minimum wage, for example, which affects millions of people's livelihoods. So I think they have, I think they've done well. Personally, I think they've done well in their government, in their government roles.
So Jorge, even as they're in this government and are providing things, they're also, just face this very tough election. I mean, what do you see as the new landscape in Podemos's, where they fit in it, based especially on that last result? I know that there's Mas Madrid, kind of a liberal party on the rise. Maybe you can talk a little bit about them, because that might be a new flavor of what's to come.
Well, it's really interesting because now I think that especially the left spectrum is in offer. So different political parties are trying to keep the attention of undecided voters. I think that is really interesting because we have two alternatives at this moment. One is Podemos, but Podemos is really complex, as we can see, especially because, as we discussed before, Yone Belarra probably would be the next leader, but the candidate probably will be Yolanda Díaz, that she is the current labor minister, and she's really popular, she's really competent, even I think that in the current government, it's a government in which you don't find specific, really charismatic people. And I think that Yolanda Díaz is the most charismatic member of the current cabinet of the current government, So I think that she's really interesting politician, and let's see what happened with her, because she's not member of Podemos, she's member of the Communist Party. So it's really interesting what is happening in this kind of relationship between Díaz and Yone Belarra, Podemos, the bureaucracy of the political party, and Yolanda Díaz and her charismatic character. So this is one. And the other alternative is Mas Madrid. In the last elections in Madrid, Mas Madrid, that is, its leader is Íñigo Errejón, former member of Podemos, and he was a really close friend of Pablo Iglesias, but they split up, and now it's a kind of revenge. Errejón has created this political party that is, as you said, more liberal, more centrist. I think that is a more comfortable ally for PSOE. because he's closer in ideological terms. I think that Mas Madrid is looking for the green discourse in the Spanish politics. It's true that in the last decades in Spain, there has been different attempts to create a green party, but it didn't work. But now we have a new contest with Greta Thunberg, maybe the Greens in Germany win the elections, people are more sensible about environment, you know. So I think that Errejón is creating a really clever strategy, because he's mixing this discourse with some progressive items, and he is creating a communication strategy for young people with Twitch, with memes, with, you know, different and funny language. And I think that this is an interesting competition, because I think that Yolanda Díaz will be more leftist, but Errejón will be more catch-all party. And I think that is interesting, because in general, when you are a catch-all party and the society doesn't have a really ideological preference, maybe you win. But let's see what happens. Let's see how will be the pandemic consequences in a couple of years, when the elections, in theory, elections will take place, in theory, because you never know in politics. Maybe the next month, and as Paolo said before, we have had a lot of elections in the last 7 years. We love elections, so let's see.
Yeah, like Texas. I mean, I often say in America, we're really good at suppressing the vote, and one of the most effective ways is to keep having elections, not to not have them. It's just you keep having them relentlessly. I'm going to let you have the last word, Paolo, but I do want to ask, what Jorge is describing is sort of the recipe for the original problem in a way, though, right? Which was that the center-left has sort of a coalition of the young and cosmopolitan elites, working and is losing working class, disaffected families and traditional left voters. If Mas Madrid is the new model, is that opening it up for right-wing expansion or for revitalized Podemos, or take out the crystal ball? Sorry to make you do that.
I think that, I sympathize a lot with Errejón's strategy and the left populist strategy, and in that sense, I was agreeing with Cristina's assertion that the biggest mistake Podemos did was align itself with Izquierda Unida, which has produced excellent political personnel. There's no denying that. People like Alberto Garzón and Yolanda Díaz are people who are really good at what they do. Technically, they have morally indisputable, they are reassuring, but they're lacking that something, I don't know, that kind of indefinite quality, which allows them to create a sentimental connection with the people, right? They look too much like functionaries of a bygone era, right? And like it or not, these days people like to love or identify themselves with a celebrity politician, right? Like it or not, it's a bit what the game of politics is these days. And this type of political personnel doesn't really manage it. So while I kind of sympathize with the left populist strategy proposed by Errejón, we know that Mas País in the last elections, where it surprisingly ran at the last minute, it didn't do well. It just got kind of 3%, if I remember correctly, in the vote. And the vote was very concentrated in big cities, right? In particular Madrid, maybe Barcelona. And so the risk there is that it's more of a kind of urban middle class party with interesting platforms, but not able to do what is decisive now to defeat the right. That is, recuperate working class votes, recuperate manual workers' votes, right? Which is what Podemos managed to do a little bit at the beginning, because it had, on the one hand, a kind of young middle class vote, on the other hand, a kind of precarious working class vote, and it ended up losing that. And the PSOE still has some union vote, but the PSOE has become itself a middle class party, in the sense that it is like the old working class that has gotten a bit better, now has homes, and because it has a little home, sometimes thinks it is the middle class. You could see that on the controversy on the rent controls, which was signed by PSOE and Podemos when they were negotiating government, and ultimately PSOE backtracked from that, which is a perfect reflection of the fact that the PSOE now represents also many voters who just want to defend their property, right? I mean, whatever that is, for how small the property may be, right? This is a general tendency in European societies, right? Especially older voters with property start thinking like the right does, right? Yeah. So that is really a tough situation. I mean, how you construct a project, and also a green project that actually speaks to workers. Because also environmental discourse needs to change. I mean, environmental discourse needs to be framed in terms of jobs. Well-paid manual jobs in regionally depressed regions, right? Because that's really the winning card of the Green New Deal. The winning card of the Green New Deal is not only that it's going to do things about climate change, but is that it is going to offer jobs that by their nature
development. Yeah,
are very dispersed and are well paid. So I think that one would need to have that as an ingredient for a winning proposal after all that has happened.
I would agree. I think we probably all would agree. You know, everybody sort of, especially in the pandemic, which we touched on, you know, sort of briefly, I always say there's no libertarians in a pandemic, the way that there's no atheists in a foxhole. Everything's kind of gotten whacked over that direction. It's just nobody trusts anybody to deliver social democracy. And I think this is sort of a communications and policy failure of the center left globally. And that's why we have shows like this to talk about it. But thank you so much for coming on, Cristina, Jorge, Paolo. And hopefully you can come on back soon. And as we get closer to the elections, we can see what's shaking out.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation.
editor. The conflict that has erupted between undisciplined citizens and community leaders is most unfortunate. The measures taken by the authorities were very effective and convinced me that it was possible to get people to respect order. But no answer has been found to the question, why did people continue to cross over in the old way? I could understand if only mischievous teenagers were involved, but the situation affected even our most serious adult citizens. Although I'm not aware of all the ramifications, I suggest that the barbed wire be removed, if only to avoid unpleasant incidents. Let the fate of the overpass be determined by each citizen's conscience. But I will continue to use the overpass, alone if necessary. Sincerely yours, Martha Jacopo.
Hey everybody, welcome to the committee program. I'm your host, Arun Chaudhary, and we have a very special segment where we are talking to someone who I was actually able to work with during the 2019 general election in the UK on behalf of Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, if you all remember that name. It seems like it's been a while. Michael Walker, but you all will know him as one of the stars of Novara Media, which is, I think, one of the real international... for the U.S. audience, which, Michael, is most of our audience, has really broken through to the American audience and is kind of giving them a lot of their first glance at international politics. But, Michael, thank you so much for coming on. You know, when I told you we were doing a program, I was even a little embarrassed because you all are doing the real thing and we're just kind of trying to, like, put on our little vaudeville show, you know?
It took us a very long time to get there. There were lots of iterations beforehand. I did like a workshop with, I can't remember, I think they were Canadian, about like alternative media, and I was putting together a presentation or something. I was going to show links of shows from like 5 years ago, and I couldn't, because I just hated watching them. They just made me feel a bit embarrassed, so I just described them to them. I was like, I'm not going to show you this clip, but what it used to be like was this, and then I didn't show them anything until like the last 6 months.
Well, I mean, what was the show like 5 years ago? Because you joined after it had been going for a little bit. It had been founded. Actually, can you walk us through the origin story?
Yep. So Novara Media was started in 2010 or 2011 by Aaron Bastani and James Butler, two of my colleagues, and it started as a weekly podcast. And then a colleague called Craig joined and set up the articles team. And before I joined, which is in sort of 2015, they did have a video operation. They had some really great videos actually on YouTube, but they didn't have a show. And I'd just been living in Spain for a year, in Madrid for a year, and I was really into this show La Tuerca and Forte Pace, which were both Pablo Iglesias, the Podemos lot, had these really great hour-long shows, and that was one of the ways I sort of learnt Spanish at the time. I forgot it all now, very, very sadly. But that was kind of what I wanted to do, come back to the UK, set up something like that. Jeremy Corbyn had just got elected, so it felt like elected leader, obviously, not Prime Minister. So it felt like a relevant time to be doing that kind of thing. So I pitched a show to Novara. I knew a couple of them already, and then at the beginning it was I suppose a bit dull, a bit, and then it had lots and lots of different iterations until it's finally got to where it is today, which has been like for about a year. And I mean, it's only been my job for less than a year, probably, maybe a year. A little bit more than a year, actually.
A little bit more than a year, because I think maybe it was just becoming your job when we were working on the general election together in October 2019. Because you definitely had regular times you had to be at the studio for sure. Like, I remember this. Yeah. You were like...
No, but it was a weekly show before. So it was a weekly show, so it was very much a part-time job, whereas now I'm a full-time. So we've sort of massively expanded in the last year, which is super nice.
It's so interesting that you talk about Pablo Iglesias and sort of, his work because we actually talk about it in this episode, we have a Podemos segment, but in his kind of work as a media figure inside a movement, right? There was no party when he started doing a lot of this stuff. It was the M15. What do you think of, like, when you think of people being like, you all sort of represent maybe the progressive wing of labor would be a way to describe it to the American audience, but that's not exactly it. Right, like what do you think is Novara Media's relation to the Labour Party, if that's a question that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does make sense. And originally it had nothing to do with the Labour Party. I mean, the Labour Party was...
we worked adjacent to the Labour Party in the...
But also in those first 5 years in Novara Media when I wasn't involved, some people were, but the milieu that me and most of the people in Novara moved in was not into party politics. Was a bit more sort of like anarcho-communist kind of vibe. That was actually one of the things I really found exciting when I was in Spain and with La Tuerca and stuff, which they were taking very seriously, like this idea of state power. So that was when I was like, oh, the party turned, now everything makes a bit more sense. Then by the time I came back, obviously Jeremy Corbyn had been elected, and one, he was much closer to our politics than any previous party leader, and two, I mean, he got elected really without any of the infrastructure needed to make it a success. So there was a sort of sense in which both I think less as a media organisation, more as personal political commentators, that we felt sort of like, God, this guy needs some outriders. So we rallied around a little bit, and we definitely did feel, part of that project. Since he's gone, that's no longer the case. We're definitely not outriders for Keir Starmer's Labour Party, but at the same time, I've enjoyed that because now I feel like more of just a journalist, which is, I always used to think of myself as an activist first and a journalist second, whereas now I'm very much like a journalist with some...
It is amazing to hear you say that because, amazing, I'm exaggerating, but like, you very much, when we met, were like, I do journalistic-y things on the YouTube sometimes, but I am not a journalist. Do you think now that the power structure has changed in Great Britain that you do feel more akin with the journalistic community writ large?
Yeah, I think so, probably. Also because of what we've been sort of like reporting. Yeah, well, there's no obvious political leaders to rally around at the moment. Our political system means that you can't do the Podemos thing and go into politics. There's no proportional representation, and I'm really enjoying just like journalism at the moment. Obviously, it's very politically motivated. We don't pretend to be neutral, and especially with COVID as well, we sort of covered it, I think, in quite a not a traditional way, because it was it was a bit more oppositional and questioning than the mainstream press. But we were trying to explain stuff to the audience, not say this guy's an idiot, this guy's right, blah 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 blah. You know what I mean? And I did really enjoy that. It's quite liberating. I think the show has definitely improved now that we're journalists first, activists second, instead of the other way around.
Because you can actually ask, waiting for the answer instead of needing a certain path to go down, or do you think it's just sort of...
Exactly. Well, I think it's a better starting question is, how do you make this interesting to my audience? How do I make the audience understand what's going on better, instead of how can I use this hour as a propaganda tool? I'm not saying we ever did that explicitly, but that was definitely part of my motivation. And I think now, especially because, we're also in a period of time when the left is in a lull, and I think it probably will be for a while, just because of the way institutional politics work. So in a way, I do think it is about, if you're looking at it on a strategic level, what we're doing at the moment is holding space, building up big institutions that can maybe come into play in a more strategic way when there is a new Corbyn type moment. But at the moment, the most useful thing it feels to do is to build up a sort of engaging media organisation that isn't in hoc to billionaire interests or whatever.
And just to delve in on that a little more, especially considering the 2019 election and how that went, do you think, because I remember us talking about it and we kind of, we were having a hard time, right? It was obviously this was not going to be a good election, and I feel like you and I were both on that same trip, and you helped me keep on that, because every time I saw a glimmer of hope, you would re-explain it to me to be like, no, that's not what that means, actually. It actually means something horrible. But very often when we would be having discussions about what to do and who to go to, and we were working in a very London-centric environment, of course, because we were in London, and to our American audience who can't decipher accents as well as the rest of everyone, are from outer London. But in our little team, people would turn to you when they were talking about working class Northern England. What do these people want? And was that because, it's true, right? This happened all the time. They would like kind of look at you like in a meeting, people would be like, what do labor leavers want? And like look at you and you'd be like, hey man, like I don't even like, but is that because of Navarra and because of exactly the space that you guys have singled out? Or is that just because in this election people really were bewildered about like what was happening?
I think one that probably says something very worrying about the demography of the room at the time.
You remember what I mean, though, right? It would be like, what do you think?
That's more that I'm more cynical, right? So I think that was more that I'm the more cynical person. So we'll ask him about what he thinks is going really badly, and that was what was going really badly, right? Labour leavers. There's a bit sort of like, come on.
Yeah, that was our main focus.
What's gonna appeal to these people? I mean, Navarro media very much.
But like, let me ask a different way. Did Navarro media appeal to that demographic that Labor was trying to get at and failed to in 2019? The lever.
No. We're predominantly metropolitan, youngish people. I mean, we would not be.
You are blossoming the same coalition that you hope would come for a national coalition.
Yeah. I mean, we wouldn't be able to win a general election with our audience. I mean, even if it was, bigger. But we have a quite a similar demographic to the people who like Jeremy Corbyn, I think. So I don't think we don't speak to Labour leavers. I mean, I'm not like we don't speak to Labour leavers. I mean, I'd love to speak to Labour leavers, and we speak to some, and we weren't. There were big parts of alternative media in those days that went super Remain. Where the EU was wonderful and all we needed was a second referendum. We never did that, but at the same time, I mean, I think our demographic is not what we call now the red wall voters, which is traditional Labour voters who switched to the Conservatives over Brexit. I mean, they tend to be a bit older and without a university education, whereas I imagine our audience is very much skewed towards people with university educations and probably skewed to be fairly young. So yeah, I don't think I was being asked that because people were like, Labour leavers because of Navarro media. I think they were just like...
It was like you're white, your hair's a bit short. Maybe you know what these people want.
Exactly. Maybe it was that.
Yeah. It's so funny how I look up on those days now because, like, at the time, even you and I would be canvassing somewhere and it would always be, I'm not voting for that man and I'm angry. And sort of it was easy to be like, to really focus on the personality of Jeremy Corbyn. Me looking at it, and I obviously want your take on it, but me looking at it now, it feels like maybe we put too much stock in people sort of expressing that, I won't vote it because of Jeremy Corbyn. It seems like now it's not true. They were just looking for a reason because of big structural problems in labor and sort of found Jeremy Corbyn. I find myself much more forgiving to the personality of Jeremy Corbyn now than I did in 2019, where it was like, come on, dude, make these people vote for you.
I'm much... Well, I mean, distance makes you more forgiving, right? Because, I mean, why it was frustrating is because you're like, this whole project needs you to become prime minister, and so it's frustrating whenever he did something that didn't make that more likely. Now, I mean, obviously the big story is he was a well-meaning guy with good politics who was in an incredibly difficult situation because the entire establishment, did a character assassination over a period of 5 years, especially a period of over 3 years after 2017 when it looked like he could, potentially get into power. That onslaught just became unbelievable. And I don't think that was... I mean, I think in many cases that was potentially people looking for an excuse not to vote Labour. I mean, I think the second referendum policy was probably what really flawed, the party in most places, and that's why now Corbyn has gone. Keir Starmer, who, all of the sort of incompetent, he's hard left, he's an anti-Semite, blah, 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 he likes the IRA, all of that stuff is quite difficult to throw at Keir Starmer, and Labour are actually performing even worse in seats like Hartlepool. They just lost that under Keir Starmer, which they won under Jeremy Corbyn. So it seems like I think the long shadow of backing a second referendum, overturning the Brexit referendum, will last much longer than any of the sort of prejudices people built up against Jeremy Corbyn. But I mean, I think definitely both came into play in 2019.
Yeah, I guess it just made me think, like, do we put, like, even as practitioners who should know better, if we're on the doorstep, do we just... There's a thing in movies, the smartest editing teacher I ever had, Carol Dysinger, who actually won an Academy Award last year. Carol Dysinger, we're very proud of her. she always said someone watching her movie is always exactly correct about what's wrong with it and almost always exactly incorrect about how to fix it. So if they're like, that part of your movie seemed weird, they're 100% right. But if they're like, I think you should shorten all the shots, then make all the shots longer because they don't know what the hell is going on. And
Yeah, no, I think that's
like it might have been like, there's these big things that are happening, and so we just grasp at the most obvious thing. But to go back to the practitioners kind of part of it, you were saying before we started recording that actually Navarra, unlike a lot of different left-wing organizations, left-wing media organizations, has actually been experiencing a boom online and having more folks coming online. And do you think is some of that getting away from this personality-driven politics and, as you say, being sort of more allowed to sort of, when you say journalistic, I'm going to throw another word on there, but kind of just a more worldview, ideological, position on things?
I think it's partly that. It's also more just that we're now much more professional about it. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was incredibly distracting in a way, because you were never sure, is the priority to be a Labour activist, to sort of work supporting the Labour Party, is the priority to build our own media organisation, and that sort of pulled us in two directions. Now that's gone and it's over. Our focus is building Navarra Media. So that's I think sort of focused our minds. I do think probably the content has got a bit more interesting now as well because we're not in that news cycle. Although I do think that if we had the professionalism we sort of built up in the last year, and Jeremy Corbyn was a leader, I think that would have also been kind of nice.
That probably would have multiplier also.
Yeah, exactly. I think our growth now is probably more about our, as a small group of people, the way that we've all been able to personally commit over the past 12 months, as opposed to that Jeremy Corbyn was stopping us doing that, even though it is good that we've got our 100% focus on that now, I think.
The new growth, I mean, do you know, is it folks in the UK or is it a much more broad international swath?
It's difficult to say, actually. I'm trying to think what... I haven't looked at the analytics. As I say, I'm kind of a real idiot when it comes to anything technological.
No, your personality. You're not an idiot. Your personality.
I do have the YouTube app on my phone, so I look at the number. All I look at is the numbers and the subscribers. We definitely had the best month ever this month, and that's partly because lots have been happening. But then also, I think the videos that we've had that have gone huge probably do have an international audience because there was Palestinians call out CNN bias, which was CNN and Newsnight actually, sorry. So that was a sort of like transatlantic story, or anywhere story to be honest. And a Bella Hadid one, which did very well, which would have also, that could have had an American audience. We still do find the videos that do the best are about Prince Andrew, which I think is maybe Americans looking for British people to explain to them
you're 100%
this monstrosity
right.
that we've created, that we sadly have some ownership for.
No, I think you're actually really, like, Americans have this sick fascination with the royals, especially when things are like going wrong, and they just
yeah.
And actually, I will say, like, even as the White House videographer or whatever, like, there was never a time where you'd get a random email from a staffer being like, "Hey, can you bring me into a room?" Unless like there was a member of the British royal family
really
on campus, in which case random people would be like, "Hey, I just want to stand in that room. Can you pretend I need to be there to hold a light or something?" Yeah. And I would always try to accommodate these things. But yeah, I do find the American fascination for the British royals to be, an odd choice.
The Harry and Meghan one, that was a very good moment as well. It was very fun. So I think we've got better at sort of covering pop culture stuff with a sort of like political angle. Instead of, I think probably that was also another problem with the Corbyn years, which was that we were quite Westminster focused, and now we can, sort of survey what's going on in a slightly, with more of an open mind, let's say.
When you do these international things, because our show is really based on the idea, especially of introducing American audiences to, more global solidarity and pushing things. Like, what are the opportunities that you see for there being global solidarity? I think if pieces like Palestine, when there's something happening that is kind of part of the world community, it makes sense. But so often these things are localized with just people looking over the fence. I'm sure you've watched American elections before from afar, being like, I don't really know. And like, we watch British elections. Like, what do you see, other than us telling stories on YouTube to each other, what do you see as the focal points for global solidarity on the left?
Interesting question. What for global? I suppose in a way. Well, I mean, I think that the Israel-Palestine. I don't call it Israel-Palestine conflict anymore. Sorry, the occupation of Palestine. Is, or the war on Palestine, however we want to frame it. I think that's a good example of how global solidarity has worked in practice in a way. Obviously, it's an easy example to take because that's something that people are already interested in. It's much harder if you're talking about what's going on in Colombia or something, where it's very difficult to get a
But it's also technology, right? Like I will tell you, like I was in Gaza in 2003. I forget when Rachel Curry died. Who's an American activist who was run over by a bulldozer in Rafah, Gaza, horrible, just split open like a melon because, this is what happens, and she was trying to defend the homes of her Palestinian comrades. And, people talked about it, and I was even there with a documentary crew interviewing people about it, right? But people today don't even know who she is. So I do think that there is just the ability to have this alternative media structure is what's different now between any of the previous intifadas, especially.
Oh, totally. And also, I mean, I think what's been really interesting in this, the bombardment that's just happened is the extent to which we've seen, really radical Palestinians on mainstream media, which then gets massively boosted by social media and alternative media. So Mohammed El-Kurd, for example, obviously that interview he did with CNN that went absolutely viral. It was that interplay between the mainstream media and then it getting boosted and discussed on social media and alternative media. I mean, we did quite a lot on that particular video, which I do think that means this time around. I mean, that there is a much bigger voice for. No one's doing the whole sort of we condemn both Israel and Hamas, which obviously doesn't mean we support Hamas, but it means that we recognise that there's no point in just saying we condemn both sides. Can we just have peace and everyone come together? Which I do think was still I mean, some people are like that in Britain, but I mean, the left has been quite.
It's been definitely 100%
more disciplined this time around, which was definitely led by Palestinians in Palestine speaking to international media, and then that getting boosted within left networks on social media and on sort of left wing shows.
And then asking you as a media person and not as a tactician for the army, of course. But do you think Israel's kind of new focus on infrastructure, on communications infrastructure, reflects a bit of the fact that world opinion is being changed by YouTube clips, Twitter clips, these kinds of things? Because we do see.
Has there been much of a focus? I feel like they've had a terrible conflict when it comes to online. I'd have thought whoever's in charge of that is
because it's hard to get down. I worked there in a documentary, during the second Intifada, and it was. We deliberately didn't put press on our car going into the occupied territories because we actually were worried that would make us a target. And I feel like sort of that kind of war on the press was always a thing. Especially with Israeli more progressive reporters who would find themselves, getting in all kinds of trouble. But now, when it comes to sort of knocking big buildings that have antennas on them down,
right? You mean that? So I thought you meant.
I wonder if sometimes what they're going
an
after.
Ideological war online. You mean something more crude, which is just bombing the news building?
Yeah, if they're like, can we shut down YouTube just by bombing it?
Yeah.
Because that is the difference,
they don't know where my bedroom is.
World opinion, I think, is 100% being shaped by these little clips. There's the 10-year-old girl being like, why is this happening? There's, this is maybe a case where social media really is making the difference.
Yeah, I mean, I do think. I don't see how bombing the AP building was particularly strategically helpful for Israel.
No, because I still don't get it. So I'm like, was it we need less stories, or was it because it's a bad story, right?
It is a bad, and no one's going to stop covering it because I mean, I know they were. What was annoying with the BBC is when the ceasefire was called. Jeremy Bowen, who's the Middle East editor at the BBC, is actually very good. When he's speaking, it's much more convincing than the storylines from London. But he, on the radio just that day, was like, I can finally go into Gaza. I haven't been let in for 11 days. It's like, you should have told us that at the beginning, right? He only thought to mention it at the end. So I don't know if if there were
reporting
so few
from my
journalists there
Tel
and they
Aviv
thought
hotel room, you know, like
if they thought the only journalists that were in there were housed in that building, and if they took out that building, then that could. But I mean, then it was to anyway. I probably can't work out what the logic of was of the Israelis in that particular move.
It was really funny. Funny in a sick way, but I worked on a documentary when I was spending time in the West Bank and Gaza, and the focus of the documentary was actually on news coverage. So we would like go into Gaza and like interview reporters who were there, and it was just funny. There were very few reporters who would actually be there. You know, like most people would report on it from 10 miles across the Israeli border, which might as well be in suburban New Jersey if you've been there. Like, you know, it is a world of difference. The people who were in there were actually a lot of sort of very foreign journalists. In fact, I remember a beautiful interview you did with a Japanese journalist who was like, I think I'm the best correspondent in the Middle East because nobody suspects me of having an agenda. They let me everywhere and they tell me everything. I'm just here from Radio Tokyo. Nobody's mad.
It's interesting you mentioned that, actually. I mean, potentially one of the big differences this time around was so much of the repression was in East Jerusalem, and journalists are in East Jerusalem, right? So we saw a lot more of that, and you saw there was a really great Sky correspondent who was based in East Jerusalem who was always giving, you know, these sort of, video journals sort of saying the police have attacked these people. They weren't doing anything. They're spraying, skunk water on them. It smells rancid. So the oppression was happening right in front of journalists, which I suppose when, the previous onslaughts mainly took place in Gaza, the journalists weren't.
It is in a ghettoed
right
area, to use that word very literally. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's interesting. I didn't think about that. No, because East Jerusalem is, of course, especially if you have, the right passport, a very permeable border to get in and out, of course, unless you're Palestinian. This is obviously a big story that's happening now. What are other things that are happening in Navarro Media that you're working on that you'd like to tell us about? And then also, if you have any big structural things, we'd like to steal all of your ideas for our show because you're doing well.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
So what do you mean, big things? What are we talking about? What are the big news stories in
so
the UK
first,
at the
what are
moment?
you talking about? What's coming up so that our audience who may not totally be familiar can make sure they tune in to find out what they want to know about. But then also, I want to know, are y'all going to be holograms? Like, what's the plan?
Yeah. No one's going to hologram me. We're gonna remain real flesh and blood.
It will be
on
two-dimensional
Navarro
movements.
Media. What will we be talking about? I mean, yesterday we did a big show on Dominic Cummings, who, for anyone who doesn't know, was Boris Johnson's key advisor, who has now left that job and is doing everything in his power to bring down the Prime Minister. So he gave a 7-hour. It's the longest I've ever watched the House.
It's like Castro eulogizing Che. I mean, this is a long time. Yeah.
It was such a long time, but the whole thing was super engaging. So there'll be a fallout from that for a very long time. In terms of, he's sort of talking about all the mistakes that were made during the COVID crisis, which just basically structured our coverage for the past 12 months. So in a way, it's sort of going over old ground, but because it's now been made politically relevant again. An ongoing story is the collapse of the Labour Party under Keir Starmer. So we had a very entertaining weekend a couple of weeks ago where he tried to sack his deputy. It failed. It's the first time it looks like he could be on the way out, which would obviously be very exciting because he has made it his mission, despite getting elected, on the premise of sort of like, I'm going to be competent, but I'm going to be like, I'll have the policies of Corbyn, but I'm a Sir Keir Starmer. I wear a suit well, and I look, competent. I used to prosecute people. No one's going to call me an IRA supporter, but I'll keep the policies and have a big tent thing. And then the moment he gets elected, he kicks out Corbyn, attacks the left. We all hate him. It turns out most of the public do as well. So that'll be a long-running story. There's a by-election coming up soon that could be the moment when he's forced to stand down if we lose it.
Which by-election is this?
So they've just announced the date today, actually. It will be on the 1st of July in Batley-and-Spen, which, again, was a seat that Labour held by quite a large margin under Jeremy Corbyn. But because Keir Starmer's just lost Hartlepool, which was the first by-election under his leadership, if he loses this second one, which again is in a sort of Brexit voting town, then that will be when people start to be like, "Oh, something's going really wrong." And if there were to be a challenge, it would be after that.
I don't know where the seat is, so you'll tell me to go fly kite, and then I'm wrong. But is the NIP fielding anybody in this one?
They might be. I mean, it's in South Yorkshire, Batley and Spen, but it's. I mean, the Northern Independence Party got 250 votes, I think, in Hartlepool. So it didn't translate into a particularly electorally competitive.
It stayed very online, as the kids
movement.
say.
It stayed very online, yeah.
Yeah. Ah, God, so interesting though, because I don't know. It just seems like the Labour fall is so sort of weird and staged, in that it feels like they lose the same voters in multiple elections. Like Democrats lose voters and lose them for a decade. But it feels like the Labour one is a little kind of slower because the different elections have slightly different flavors. But you think this one is finally the referendum on Keir Starmer's leadership?
I mean, they should win it anyway, and I don't. If they win it, I don't want that to be.
But if they don't win it by enough, it's
no.
Like,
if the expectations are so low that if he wins it, he'll remain leader for at least 6 months to a year. But yeah, if he loses it, there'll be serious pressure, and that will be interesting.
And you'll hear all about it on Navarro Media, I'm sure, because this will be your all's favorite thing. Thank you so much for talking to us, just sort of about, you all just run a very good, tight, smart operation that, we want to emulate. And it just seems like the more the international community talks about this stuff, the better we can do. So, I'm just grateful that you all exist. And I'm grateful for you, of course, for all you're introducing me to UK politics and helping me out so much.
I'm grateful for you helping us out in that 2019 election, even if it went terribly.
We had a pretty good time.
We tried our best.
Sometimes we didn't, but most of the time we had a pretty good time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. A real pleasure, a real honor to be on.
Comitato, comitiet, comiteto, corul, comiti, we young way, submiti. With committee.
Dear Editor, it may seem somewhat unusual that I, one of the first to ask for and praise the building of the overpass, an instigator of it, so to speak, well, it may not seem quite normal that I now criticize that structure. But I must confess that a short time ago I stopped setting an example. I came down from the overpass and joined my friends. Now, like them, I use the older and shorter path. I find it impossible to believe that all these people are not right. I can only believe that there is something wrong with the overpass. Sincerely yours, Martha Chaffel. But there's nothing wrong with it now.
do you wash your hair?
A couple times a week. In Germany, it's that the water is very hard and it's been very bad for my hair. My hair didn't used to be this dry. Yeah, because of calcium, you know, so now I'm using all these like extra moisture, this, that. It's not the same, you know, like
I sense the moisture. Like it's,
but at the same time, it's the water still makes it. Yeah, my hair's not used to it. It's used to American water.
Finally open.
Oh, hi. I'm so glad you're still here. In fact, I'm still here in Pristina, Kosovo, where we've been all week. This is a place where I actually work in politics for the last couple of years and have really fallen in love with the place. But it's amazing, this young country, the youngest republic in Europe, youngest country in Europe, is an ancient, beautiful place. And when you look around and you see all of the Roman ruins, all the way through the Byzantines, all the way through the Ottomans, all the way through the Yugoslavs, all the way through now, it's an incredible march of history. And it made me dive deeper into our readings book to an older piece, a speech by Tiberius Gracchus, who is of the Gracchi, who are a Roman populist family in the mid-Republic, who are sort of famous for being tribunes and fighting for agricultural reform and this type of thing. It didn't end well for them. But this is a little piece about accountability, power, etc., etc. The person of a tribune I acknowledge is sacred and inviolable, because he is consecrated to the people and takes their interest under his protection. But when he deserts those interests and he becomes an oppressor of the people, when he retrenches their privileges and takes away their liberty of voting, by those acts he deprives himself, for he no longer keeps the intention of his employment. Otherwise, if a tribune should demolish the capital and burn the docks and all the naval stores, his person could not be touched. A man who should do such things as those might still be tribune, though a vile one. But he who diminishes the privileges of the people ceases to be a tribune of the people. Does it not shock you to think that a tribune should be able to imprison a consul, and that the people not have it in their power to deprive a tribune of his authority when he uses it against those who gave it? For the tribunes, as well as the consuls, are elected by the people. Kingly government seems to comprehend all authority in itself, and kings are consecrated with the most awful ceremonies. Yet the citizens expelled Tarquin, the dynastic rulers of Rome when it was a kingdom, when his administration became iniquitous, and for those offenses of one man, the ancient government, under whose auspicious Rome was erected, was entirely abolished. What is there in Rome so sacred and vulnerable as the Vestal Virgins who keep the perpetual fire? Yet if any of them transgress the rules of her order, she is buried alive. For they who are guilty of impiety against the gods lose that sacred character, which they had only for the sake of the gods. So a tribune who injures the people can no longer be sacred or inviolable on the people's account. He destroys that power in which alone his strength lay. If it is just for him to be invested with the tribunal authority by a majority of tribes, is it not more just for him to be deposed by the suffrages of them all? What is more sacred and inviolable than the offerings in the temples of the gods? Yet no one pretends to hinder the people from making use of them or removing them whenever they please. And indeed, the tribune's office is not inviolable or unremovable. Appears from hence that several have voluntarily laid it down or been discharged at their own request. Thanks so much for being with us again this week. We are the committee program. I'm Arun Chaudhary. Good night. Mere note. Jack, mere note? Mere note, eh? We're going to have to look that up.